Headley the man, Headley's one of the most interesting and dangerous and unique figures I've come across in the many cases of terrorism I've looked at around the world, whether American or foreign. He's different than a lot of the jihadis you come across. He's older, for one thing. He's almost twice as old. He's a man who really gets involved in this in his 40s. He's 52 now. He has this profile of someone from both the Pakistani and the American elite. He's a businessman. He's very cosmopolitan. And there's a curious set of contradictions going on, because on the one hand, he certainly is very, you could say, extremist or fundamentalist, even fanatical in his Islamic beliefs, but his lifestyle is certainly not the typical jihadi, austere, self-denying lifestyle. He's someone who enjoyed the good life, who would drink, who would use drugs at certain points, who sort of had a kind of almost a playboy lifestyle. And he's also different because he's fundamentally not just a terrorist. As the evidence shows, he's an intelligence operative. He's a trained operative, a trained agent, a trained spy of the Pakistani intelligence service. So he has much better tradecraft than a lot of the people you see involved, even in successful terrorist plots, because of this state connection, this state-sponsored aspect of the plots he's involved in. And the other thing I think that's interesting is he also has a bit of a mercenary quality in that he starts with Lashkar-e-Taiba, then moves, kind of brings his plot to Al-Qaeda, which is very interesting, kind of shopping his skills and his expertise. And of course, I mean, one of the things in terms of when you ask about his personality is this quality almost like a chameleon to shift, to be very at ease and very Western if he needs to be, very Pakistani if he needs to be able to function in India, which is a country he says he hates, but to fool people. I mean, he's very good, he's very manipulative at fooling people in general. He juggles relationships, whether with intelligence or law enforcement agencies. As you remember, he was a Drug Enforcement Administration informant. Then he shifts to, he's also a drug trafficker. He works for the ISI, Al-Qaeda, Lashkar. He juggles relationships where he has different wives at different times, some of them simultaneously, and manages to keep those relationships somehow compartmentalized and secret from people. So he's really a master of manipulation, of deception, and he has this capacity, as many people do in this milieu, informants do, to be able to turn around and betray people when he needs to betray them. So to gain confidence and then to betray people at the drop of a hat to survive. You know, he always has something when he gets caught. He always has something that he tries to bargain with, and it usually works to some extent. I think partly. I think, you know, one of the intelligence veterans we talked to said he has this love of the game, and I think that's certainly part of it, this love for adrenaline, for danger. With I think there's some signs that he really was attracted by that. This is a guy, don't forget, who goes to military school in Pakistan and tries to go to military school in the United States, washes out both times, but I think he remained with this fascination for being a soldier and being a warrior and being part of in special forces and sort of channels that into being an undercover operative and spy. So I think there's a fascination. I think he really, the Pakistani nationalist and Islamist, which goes together, right, in the Pakistani context, that Islamic extremist and Pakistani nationalist ideology, that cocktail ideology, he believed in, you know, and I think it was instilled in him from a young age. And there was always a core of him that held on to that, and I think that explains the hatred of India. And though he became very Western, I think that whole part of him that, you know, has a real hatred for Western excess, what he would see as Western excess, or, you know, sacrilege, and for example, the cartoons against Muhammad, and some of the very intolerant things he says, very anti-Semitic things like that. You know, that stuff. There was an ideological core to him, but he was also flexible about it in terms of his lifestyle that always didn't hew to that rigid discipline. Well, he certainly worked as an informant of the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration. That is absolutely documented, and it's also clear that right after 9/11, in September of 2001, his mission expands. The DEA contacts him in the days after 9/11 and tasks him to start gathering intelligence on militants and on extremists, both at a mosque on the ground in New York and working his extensive contacts in Pakistan over the phone and seeing who we can deal with. He was ideal for the DEA and other U.S. agencies at the time because there was a great need for intelligence in Pakistan, and he was someone who had contacts, who spoke the language, who could travel back and forth. So yes, his role expands and he starts gathering intelligence on terrorism. Then there's a still mysterious chapter where the official story is that he's deactivated as an informant, but the facts and the recollection of many people would suggest that he's actually launched as something perhaps as a kind of off-the-books informant, more focused on intelligence than on law enforcement intelligence gathering, because his probation is abruptly terminated 3 years early, which is extraordinary, and he's rushed off to Pakistan, or he rushes off to Pakistan. He, in fact, tells people close to him that he's going to work for the U.S. government. And different people in the U.S. government have different versions. The DEA says no, he was deactivated within months after that departure. You know, so but he goes to train in Lashkar within a couple of months after that. He starts training with Lashkar. So others say no, he started training with Lashkar at the same time as that he was still an informant, and that's because he was gathering intelligence. That is still one of the murkiest things in the case, which the U.S. government has been very reticent to talk about. I can certainly understand the frustration and the anger in India. And certainly it's pretty extraordinary to have someone who pleaded guilty to that many murders, because ultimately he was a direct accomplice in that number of murders in Mumbai, and a very barbaric plot in Denmark, don't forget, to get the sentence he got. But it is also true that the U.S. law enforcement system to fight terrorism is based very much on these kinds of plea agreements, and there's case after case of people connected to Al-Qaeda and other groups who were involved in very murderous activity who've gotten reduced sentences. I mean, let's look at it coldly and analytically. The man is going to spend most of the rest of his life, if not the rest of his life, in prison. He's going to get out when he's you know, in his late 70s, early 80s. And if you look at the amount of information he gave, it's true that even though U.S. intelligence and law enforcement had a lot of information already on the case, without Headley's evidence, it's hard to believe that the U.S. government, for example, could have indicted people in the ISI or indicted Sajid Mir, the mastermind of the attack. So people in India who are angry, I certainly understand that, but they should look also that because of Headley, this information has come out in the public arena, perhaps for the first time, if that's what they're angry about, which is the involvement of Lashkar-e-Taiba people who are still being protected or sheltered in Pakistan, and at least one Pakistani intelligence officer who it seems there's very strong evidence played a direct role in this plot. That is thanks to this plea bargain. I think what's more frustrating and for a lot of people in India and the United States are two things. One, not as much the sentence he got, but the fact that he's it. In other words, he got that sentence, and if that plea bargain would have then led to the immediate capture of higher ranking people, it would be easier to understand to say, okay, they got Headley, who was kind of mid-level, and the masterminds fell as a result. But the masterminds, yes, they've been charged, but they haven't fallen, and it looks like it's going to be difficult for them to fall anytime soon because they are in Pakistan, apparently protected by the security forces. The other thing that's very frustrating, both in India and for people who follow this in the United States, is to have done this deal in such secrecy, and to still for the U.S. government not to have explained so many questions and mysteries and strange things about this case. I can certainly understand if someone in India, for example, were to say, imagine that somebody involved in the September 11th attacks had been arrested in India, and the Indian government would have grabbed him, made a deal with him, put him in prison, said, don't worry, we're taking care of it. Even though the guy would be in prison and justice would be done, I can understand how Americans would be frustrated. So I think there are things that mitigate or put in context that sentence, but I can certainly understand the frustration. Look, I think my impression, having gotten close to this case and having talked to a lot of the people involved in the actual investigation, which, as you know, the FBI is leading, I think there's no doubt that the U.S. Investigators and prosecutors have made a very determined effort to go after people like Sajid Mir and Major Iqbal, in trying to identifying them and to pressuring the Pakistanis to go after them and trying to locate them. I think, you know, we shouldn't see also the U.S. government as a monolith. You know, there may be agencies, as you say, that have to deal with Pakistan and the reality of the turf of intelligence for whom this has to be less of a priority because they're worried, for example, about going after other people or the safety of their officers. But I think the law enforcement agencies that are investigating this would like nothing better than to bring these guys to justice. And I think if you look at past cases of terrorism, it's true that the FBI, for example, has a long memory, and people have been caught, you know, 3, 4, 5, 10 years after the fact. So I wouldn't say that there's nothing being done. There's a lot being done behind the scenes. People are being monitored, as we saw, for example, the person who was arrested in Saudi Arabia, the Indian suspect. That was thanks to U.S. help and to U.S. monitoring. But yes, the bottom line is there's only so much the U.S. government can do. If these guys are in Pakistan, and the Pakistani security forces absolutely will not cooperate with having them arrested, even though it's clear who they are, and in some cases even where they are. Absolutely, and it's a real labyrinth, because I think, as one European counterterror chief told me, the culture of Pakistani intelligence is very strange, in that this European counterterror official said, and Americans have said the similar things to me, you may have one unit or wing or a sector of the ISI that is working closely with the Americans in going after Al-Qaeda people and risking their lives and suffering losses. Let's not forget, Pakistan is also a victim of terrorism, and groups like Al-Qaeda attack the Pakistani state, and Pakistan goes after them. Yet there's this strange dance where groups like Lashkar are allowed to function in the open and to get away with things like Mumbai, and even to have alliances with Al-Qaeda, right? So there's a very blurry world where it appears that some people are working on the side of the West, others are working against it, and some are in the middle. And it's not clear, even though, for example, one of the things that the Mumbai case shows is that Headley and people close to him make a transition from Lashkar to Al-Qaeda, supposedly distancing themselves from the Pakistani security forces and expressing anger at the ISI. Yet they still have their own relationships with the ISI, and some of them, even though they're supposedly in Al-Qaeda, seem to be protected. So it's very murky. It's very murky. I think it's very frustrating for U.S. law enforcement, but there is still cooperation, as you say. And there's also, I think, tacit, unspoken agreements like the drone strikes, you know, which clearly go on. Pakistan protests them, but I think Pakistan much prefers the drone strikes than to have to be sending people into the wilderness to try and go after these guys and suffer casualties as a result. So there's a real complicated dance going on in that labyrinth. I mean, my impression is that I've talked to people who are directly familiar with the interrogation of him by the Indians. And my impression is that they had good, lengthy access to him. I will say there was a sense that he wasn't talking about certain things. In fact, and I'll say this because it was said on the record, a high-ranking Indian official said to me that there were certain things that there was some indication, don't ask about this, like his relationship with U.S. agencies. But if you look at just what's been made public, the NIA report on his interrogation, they covered a lot of ground. And I get the sense that in terms of access to him, I think it was pretty good. I think what may frustrate certain Indian officials is access to certain information about him. In other words, this whole question of the relationship with him, and this whole question that we've spent a lot of time working on, which is all these warnings about him to U.S. law enforcement, at least six warnings about him, 5 of them before the Mumbai attacks, and 1 right afterward, over a period of about 7 years, where people close to him repeatedly went to, above all, the FBI and said, this guy is a terrorist, this guy's involved with Lashkar, this guy's going to Pakistan to train, yet he wasn't stopped sooner, he wasn't identified sooner, and could the Mumbai attacks have been prevented as a result? That is one of the great tragic questions hovering over this case that has not been answered. You know, I'm not a great expert on Indian politics or on the case you mentioned. My impression is certainly that there's, as time goes on and the masterminds of Mumbai remain at large, and India certainly showed great restraint after the attacks of Mumbai, you know, which were an incredible, devastating, spectacular attack, and India showed great restraint in not striking back and trusted in the justice system. But as time goes on and we see that the masterminds remain at large. We see that the supposed trial in Pakistan of the Lashkar military chief seems to be in a permanent limbo. We see these questions about Headley not being answered, I think there's frustration, some nationalist sentiment in India, which is always dangerous. You know, it happens in the United States too. A certain anger, a certain desire to somehow both get revenge, strike back, and send a message of deterrent, which to some extent is certainly understandable when you worry that terrorists who've gotten away with something, if they feel there's not going to be a consequence, are going to try again. So I think my impression is that the hanging of Kasab, after I think the death penalty had not been implemented in India for quite some time, the hanging of Kasab and then this recent hanging may fit into that context of some frustration, some anger, some rising nationalism, and new tensions, even though there's attempts for some rapprochement with Pakistan, new tensions at the line in Kashmir. I think all of that probably plays in, perhaps plays into this political context in which this has happened.